Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. This is Rick Import for Orchard Software. We are thrilled that you can join us. Hopefully we can bring an hour of normalcy to you in these very far from normal times, so we really do appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to join us on today's webinar. Our session today is the role of point-of-care testing in the world of value-based contracts, and our presenter today is Matt Modleski, Executive VP for Business Development with Orchard Software, and our session is sponsored by our friends at Orchard Software. As Executive Vice President of Corporate and Business Development at Orchard Software, Matt Modleski is responsible for strengthening Orchard's corporate relationships and bringing additional value through new business opportunities. Previously, Matt led the operation of more than 70 physician practices and was a key member of the executive team at American Health Network. From 2006 to 2014, he was a partner at Stovall Granger Modleski, a healthcare consulting firm with expertise in the healthcare environment and competitive positioning. Prior to his work in healthcare sales and marketing, Matt was an accomplished pilot in the U.S. Air Force. He was awarded the 355th Wing Instructor Pilot of the Year and also a lead member of the United States Air Force Demonstration Squadron, the Thunderbirds. So, with great pleasure here, I'd like to bring Matt to our podium. Welcome to you, Matt.
That was very kind. Thanks so much for the introduction. I hope everybody's having a good day. It is kind of a crazy time in America, so let's all take a few deep breaths, get ready for some serious point-of-care testing impact on value-based contracts discussion. So as we put this webinar together, we had a lot of discussion back and forth on the fact that there are some portions of it that tend to get fairly mathematical and kind of heavy. So if you find yourself on one of those slides thinking, what in the world does this have to do with me, please take a deep breath at that point, jot a note down, and as we finish the webinar, if we haven't sort of given you a clear path out of it, ask a question, because we try to make sure that we get into the heavy meat of this, because it really does matter, and you're very important to the world of value-based contracts and the world of point-of-care testing. But if it gets a little disjointed for you, we want to make sure to bring you back with some concrete actions and steps to take. So really jazzed up about the content. It will get heavy in a few spots, but I hope that the way we've put it together and the way we walk you out of it helps you feel really good about some concrete steps you can take. So without further ado, let's get going on the learning objectives. The first thing that we want you to take away from this is look at the progression of payment models from fee-for-service to fully delegated risk, and that won't take very long. Then the next piece will be identify the key components of a value-based contract. That's important because regardless of what type of contract we're talking about, there are some key elements that are in all of them. And then after that, we're going to break down more specifically Medicare Advantage. And the reason we're going to focus so much on Medicare Advantage, there's really two reasons. One, it's one of the few types of contracts where fully delegated risk is happening across the country, and it's also the fastest growing insurance type. So if your organization's not already doing something with MA, it will be. So that's why we're going to spend a fair amount of time in the Medicare Advantage world. And then we really want you to take a giant step back from what you do and how you do it and the data that comes through point-of-care testing and really see the value that you bring to these broader contracts in your organization. We're going to do that with some real-life examples. And then the fifth thing is I want you to remember the number 3.6. It's not up here, but I promise we'll tie back into the number 3.6. It's important to remember because it really is going to drive people to use point of care more than they have before as it relates to value-based contracting. So I'm sure we'll touch on that, okay? I think we have our first couple of poll questions coming up. And what I'd like you to do is I'll read quickly read them. Are you part of a committee or team that looks at the performance of value-based contracts? And then the second one is, does your organization have an active population health management program or initiative? So if you can answer both of those, yes or no, and make sure to hit the submit button or we won't get the results. As soon as those have been tabulated, we'll pop them back up and kind of review the results. So thanks for your participation in advance of that. All right, the healthcare payment models progression. So no matter where you've been living in the world in healthcare, everybody's heard of fee-for-service. So down on the left-hand corner of this arrow, you know, we've all either lived in that world, are living still in portions of that world, and we've heard about accountable care organizations, we've heard about value-based contracts, and probably have not heard a lot about fully delegated risk, but you're going to hear more about that as Medicare Advantage continues to grow. So we're going to hop into each one of these in with some explanation here on the next slide. All right, so let's start with fee-for-service. Providers are paid for services provided on a transactional basis. So if you're running tests, you do a test, you get paid. You do 2 tests, you get paid twice. You do 100 tests, you get paid 100 times. And that's really the world that we're working our way out of. And that was a world of more transactions equals more revenue, right? And so from straight fee-for-service payment models, we moved into, I think, the real first initiative here that was on a nationwide scale was accountable care organizations, and most of those had shared savings. So most of the time, the payer, in the case of the government, and providers would have a savings pool that they would try to contribute to, and then if they met their quality and costs targets, they would both share, government and the providers share in that pool. Early on, there was only upside risk in those contracts. So in other words, I could save some money, I could maybe hit my quality metrics, and maybe I'd get some bonus money. There was never any threat of having to pay money back. So that's called an upside-only risk contract, where we have incentives, we have cost thresholds, but if we don't hit them, we don't have to pay any money back. Pretty much those upside risk-only accountable care arrangements are gone. In fact, they're all gone as of 2019. The only question is how much risk and how much do you have to pay back in a downside risk arrangement, which is the next iteration of that. So now we have performance-based incentives that target both quality and cost, but if I don't do a good job, I may have to pay some money back. So downside risk begins to put pressure on provider groups to deliver on what they're trying to achieve, and brings a little more energy to these value-based contracts. So it looks like our poll results are back in. Let me see. Are you part of a committee or team that addresses the performance of value-based contracts? 88% of us are not, and 9% of us are. Okay, great. And then, does your organization have an active population health management program initiative? We're about 50-50 split on that. So as we look at you know, the path forward here in the webinar, and when we get to questions, you know, I'll keep these numbers in mind. So very good. Thanks for your participation there. All right, so from shared risk with downside risk, meaning I might have to pay some money back, what's the next step that we want to take? Well, we want to clear up some green words. So a green word is a Miller-Hyman term. I don't know if any of you are familiar with any of the Miller-Hyman training, but it's sales and marketing training that's been out there for years. But a green word is a word that means different things to different people. And so if you wanted to test this theory in your next meeting, what you do is you say, okay, everybody write down the word strategy. and then go around the table and see if everybody agrees on what that word really means. Or you could do it with value-based contracts, which is what we're doing it with. The reality is we all have a slightly different view of what a value-based contract is, and I wanted to break down the key components of what's in these things so that they're not so scary and so that we have some common knowledge when we go to speak to the people that we think you need to speak to bring your value to the surface of the organizations that you serve. So what are some of those key components? Well, every single value-based contract has a cost component and a quality component. Typically, at least most of them today have we're still paying for some sort of fee-for-service element to most payments. Not all, but many. Obviously, if you work in the hospital environment and you're working with DRGs, you've been used to bundled payments and a capitated approach to care for longer than this has been on the ambulatory side. But providers are still paid fee-for-service for some portion of their services. The value-based contract component generally has a cost threshold that's been set and quality metrics that have been specifically targeted in the group where the contract is. So if you look at the quality metric that we have as an example here, this would be a typical or very typical type of a quality metric that you'd see in a value-based contract. We want you to have a certain percentage of your diabetic patients with hemoglobin A1Cs below a threshold of 8. That would be something that we could measure, that the payers will watch, and that a medical group would be trying to achieve. And then you go to the next bullet, and there's our cost threshold. You'll see these terms used if you join that committee over there that we polled about. Remember that committee that's looking at value-based contracts? This will be a way that we look at those contracts. Medical loss ratio, MLR, or BCR, benefit cost ratio, is typically the way this element of the contract is talked about. It's usually established based on the previous year's spending. So the payer will aggregate the claims, and then they'll go to the group who's going to manage these patients and say, okay, here's what they cost last year. In order to get paid a bonus this year, share in the savings or in the benefit of this value-based contract, we want you to lower costs by 15%. So you might have an MLR of 85% or 88%. But you're going to have a cost threshold. And then really what's interesting and why there's no one-size-fits-all, most payers involved in these value-based contracts will take a very customized approach looking at the patients that a group has and what they think can be achieved, and they'll set up that contract looking at actual claims and the acuity in that patient population, the disease burden, so to speak. So that's the common components in all the value-based contracts. If we go to the next thing I really would like you to begin to understand, it's fully delegated risk in Medicare Advantage. And fully delegated risk is very different than what most people are used to contemplating. It requires a lot of work between the payer and the provider group. They have to negotiate the way that this process is going to work. But basically what happens is the commercial payer who's managing this plan delegates the risk to a provider group who then is responsible for paying all claims for that patient population. So you could see how crazy that could be if the provider group wasn't ready to do it. And so this isn't a haphazard process. It's a well thought out process. It takes systems to do it and do it well. But the way that it ends up working is a typical relationship in a Medicare Advantage contract would be the government pays a commercial plan and then the commercial plan contracts with providers. In a delegated risk environment, instead of 85% of that money going to the plan and then paying the providers for their work, 85% of it goes to the provider group who then pays all claims for those patients. So you could see how hard that would be to do, but you could also see how a medical group who was sophisticated enough to do it could really benefit patients. It really puts a lot of power and control in the physician group who's taking care of these patients. And you'll get all kinds of great services for patients that otherwise wouldn't be provided. I can give you a good example of one that comes up many times, and that is van service to get people who are homebound to their primary care appointments. That's just one example of the resources being available, and with delegated risk, the medical group can make the decision that we're going to contract for that service so that nobody misses an appointment. You can see how valuable that would be to keeping people out of high-cost settings, which is really how all of this sort of gets pulled together. So the amount of money available in Medicare Advantage, whether delegated risk or not, is based on something called RAF, Risk Adjustment Factor. That's going to be based on a face-to-face diagnosis and very precise documentation. Okay, we're going to spend more time on this element of Medicare Advantage, but if your organization or one that your lab serves or one that your point of care testing serves is part of a Medicare Advantage contract, I will guarantee RAF scores are important to them. I'll guarantee that. So this is an area, like I said, we will spend a little bit more time on. Here's the interesting part for us in the point of care world. Regardless of whether you're fully delegated risk or simply downside risk, remember the 3.6 number I said was something I wanted you to remember? The average Medicare Advantage patient is seen 3.6 times per year. So whether I've got full risk or I just have downside risk, healthcare organizations who take on more and more risk, it becomes imperative that we actually do things while we have the patient in the office. And you're going to see that part of doing things means getting the documentation right. And then the documentation has to be supported by data. That's where you guys come in. So your point of care testing data can be wildly valuable to these contracts, both because you can do it while the patient's in the office and because they're not going to leave the office and then not go get their labs done, right? And I know we all have the best of intentions as patients to do what we're told, but I also know, and you know, that that doesn't always happen. So as more and more risk comes into the groups that you're serving, your value goes up to do more and more things at point of care, and then that data that you're collecting actually impacts these value-based contracts. So it's kind of an exciting time to be in point of care. If you can't tell I'm excited, I'm not doing a very good job, but you should be excited about being in the point of care testing world. You're growing in value every day, and quite honestly, sometimes your organizations don't know it. So that's why we're here to help, right? That's why we're here to help. All right, so one other thing I wanted to talk about specifically as it relates to Medicare Advantage is why it's so different than Medicare. I think you hear these two terms discussed as if they're interchangeable, but I want to show on paper why they're not. So as it relates to building value-based contracts, in the world that's just straight Medicare, providers send a claim into the government, and there's a fee schedule, and you get paid for that fee schedule. And it's pretty simple, right? So do something, send a claim, get paid. There's no real local knowledge in straight Medicare. Sorry, I had to take a little sip of something. So if you're looking at that model and then you shift over to Medicare Advantage and you say, okay, so they put a commercial payer in the middle of this process. So I've got United, Aetna, Humana, pretty much every major insurance company is playing in Medicare Advantage. As I said, it's the fastest growing insurance in the country. If you look at the value that brings to the value-based contracting process, commercial payers understand local market realities, right? So they have a capability as they sit down with providers to craft contracts that are meaningful in the local market. And so it's really important to understand Medicare Advantage isn't some flavor of Medicare. It's quite different than straight Medicare, and it's one of the reasons it's growing, because the customized approach to the patients in a given market can be unique, and you will see them. They'll be quite unique in the way the contracts are set up. So I hope that makes some sense. And if you have any questions about that, please, don't hesitate to ask. It's kind of an important concept. All right, calculating risk scores. I'll be honest with you, if I was standing in front of your organization and I was saying, we're going to do Medicare Advantage risk, I'd say there are 10 things that we have to really understand and be good at. And the first 9 are all calculating risk adjustment scores. The 10th is maybe improve quality in some other way. But the reason that this is so important is that the math available, the money available through the math of calculating risk scores is tremendously different based on how well you do this. And what's required in order to calculate these scores, a lot of it's just precise documentation with lab results to support it. So let's look at that. I got to click the right button. There we go. All right, risk adjustment factor. Here's how it works. And remember, I said if we got into math that made you crazy, take a deep breath, have a sip of coffee, take a note, make a note to never attend another. No, that's not right. You have to understand this math to see your value. If an average Medicare patient's RAF is 1.0, and that's the case, that's how this is set up. So a starting risk adjustment score is determined by age, demographics, race, market-based adjustment. So this is different in different markets around the country. So for easy math, let's just say it's $1,000 per member per month. So that means if you go back to the slide with, the commercial payer in the middle, that means the government is paying the commercial payer $1,000 per member per month for a RAF score of 1 in a given market, okay? CMS reimburses 1% higher for every 0.01 RAF increase. So if my RAF goes up 0.1, I get about $100 per member per month. So in the example above, if you're using $1,000, that member goes up $100 to $1,100 monthly, or $13,200 annually. And you can see that could become quite important quite fast, quite important quite fast. So let's keep working down this. So the diagnosis code drives the RAF score. RAF score drives the reimbursement. Proper documentation is what really retains the reimbursement and ultimately allows you to claim it in the first place. So let's get a little bit more into this, just a little bit more into this. Now, remember that 3.6 number I said? Look at what's required in valid HCC, which stands for hierarchical condition codes, which are really subsets of ICD-10 codes, right? So all ICD-10 codes map to these HCC, I think there are 78 or 79 HCC buckets. And this process requires a face-to-face visit. So you can't document HCC codes. You can't document this unless it's a face-to-face visit. If I'm only seeing the patient 3.6 times per year, it becomes really important to get these face-to-face visits as full of proper documentation, testing, all the things that are linked to accurately documenting disease burden. I have to do it while I have the patient in mind. And it has to be a nurse practitioner, mid-level provider, or higher. Can't be a nurse. So this starts to limit who has interaction with these patients and can get this documentation done. So, You can see number 2, stable conditioning or possibly worsening, labs or tests ordered. Oh boy, there we are. Medications adjusted. Got to have a plan of action. Is the patient stable? Do they have a protocol like a COPD protocol? Are they continuing their current meds? These are the 3 points that have to be documented. Let's go to another slide that shows even sort of more elements of what has to be captured. The importance of MEET, you'll hear this acronym: monitor, evaluate, assess, or address, and treat. The documentation, and really this documentation, these 2 slides I'd be talking to providers about, right? These are the things they have to do. The reason we're talking to you about it is I want you to see how you can support this documentation with point-of-care testing, so that when you're talking to the committee who's looking at value-based contracts, they look at you like an absolute genius when you tell them what you can do. Most people aren't thinking about the work that you do in point-of-care as it relates to these contracts, and they should be. So I'll get off my high horse there for a minute. Documentation for every diagnosis has to have the monitor, evaluate, assess, treat elements. Signs, symptoms, disease progression, disease regression. I have to monitor that, and it has to be documented. Evaluate, test results, medication effectiveness, response to treatment. All of those things require, even monitoring, disease progression, disease regression requires some level of testing. I have to have some data that shows that. And then if you get on to assess and address, ordering tests, discussion, review records, counseling, and finally is treat. So these are the important elements that the documentation has to have. Again, I wanted you to see it, to see how valuable what you do is to these MEET elements, if that makes sense. All right, you can tell I'm excited. I enjoy this content. I don't know if you enjoy it. I hope you do. I hope you're like sitting up tall, feeling very proud of the work that you do in point of care, and can start to see how it links to real value for the organizations that you're serving or part of. Let's go to a little bit more math just to illustrate that point. So now, instead of talking hypothetically about what we can do for our Medicare Advantage risk scores, we're going to look at something specific. And this is where, you know, your knowledge of technology that you're using is helpful. So if you've got rules-based technology that you're running your point of care testing through, you can start to look at this statement here and think, gosh, I wonder if we have done an eGFR on every diabetic patient that we're seeing. I could run rules on that and print a report. So every patient with diabetes should be evaluated for the many manifestations and comorbidities that come with that disease. All of them add value to the amount of money that the organization should receive to take care of these patients. And we want to get paid appropriately so we've got the right resources for patient care available to us. And remember, the further down the risk path you go, the more important that becomes, because you could end up paying for a lot of things that you don't really do yourself as an organization, so you have to contract for that service. So let's look at this. If I have a diagnosis of diabetes without complications, I have an HCC weight, a RAF score of 0.104. So if you run back to the example we were using before, that would be an additional $104 per member per month. But look at what happens if I go down and I actually do a little more work and have an eGFR, maybe some other testing done to see where all my diabetic patients are as it relates to chronic kidney disease. And I find out that I was missing a lot of that. That's an HCC weight of 0.318 or another $318 per member per month to help take care of those patients. We have a client, I will not name them, who ran a very similar set of evaluations against their own patient population and netted about $4 million for the organization by appropriately documenting the disease burden across a segment of their patient population. So it is a very valuable process that you can bring forward if somebody's not already doing it inside your organization. And specifically, if they're not using the data that you're generating in the point-of-care world. So, moving forward, you know, I was talking EGFR, so here's the breakdown. Look at stage 3 to stage 4 and what happens over on the right with the HCC weight. So I can have a very sick patient in the you know, low 30s in terms of a GFR and receive no additional compensation for that patient. I would want to know if one of those patients certainly moved into the 29 category. And so, again, if you're talking to Pop Health or who's watching these value-based contracts, just having the knowledge of the difference between stage 3 and stage 4 chronic kidney disease and what it means to your organization, just having that knowledge and being willing to work with somebody is really valuable. And if you look down below at CKD unspecified, look what happens there, 0. Now, I'm going to tell a small secret. Doctors in the fee-for-service world learned to code unspecifically. It wasn't their fault, right? CKD unspecified. We didn't need to have specific documentation because it would be in some portion of the chart or notes, etc. This is a paradigm shift for the way that providers are taught to code. And if you think about the fee-for-service world, it was all speed. So I coded unspecified so I could go faster. I didn't want to think about specific codes. I just wanted to go faster because it was a transactional system. Now we actually have to slow everybody down and get on the same page because the value is linked to the quality of the documentation, if that makes sense. And I hope it does. I hope it does. Okay, we're going to keep moving down this path. More math, a little more of an example in terms of you know, the impact of proper or documentation or poor documentation. So here we are, diabetes without complications, HCC 19 and E11.0 code. It rafts to a 0.121, and you think, well, that's not so bad. I changed my math here just to wake y'all up. Instead of 1,000 per member per month, I went with 800. So 800 per member per month times a 0.121 RAF gives an additional 9680 per member per month. Times 12, that's an $1,161 per member per year addition. And I have 500 patients in this plan, and I make an additional $580,000 a year for patient care. And you think, what's wrong with that? Well, it's just that that's not really how sick my patients were. And so if I really did some better work and slowed down a little bit, looked at all of my data, some of it coming out of point of care, which I know you're excited about. Diabetes with complications, HCC 18, RAS, or an E11.51 with peripheral angiopathy, that RAFs to 0.374. If I have vascular disease in that patient as well, that would RAF to a 0.319. Combine those together, and now I've increased my per member per month $554 times 12, 6,600 and change for the year, times 500 equals 3,326,400 increased revenue for patient care. So without the right documentation, $2,745,000 was not available or won't be available to take care of these patients. And quite honestly, we need that money, right? We need it to do the things that the patients need. So this is just an example of what your data and the things that you're doing at point of care could contribute if that data is not already being captured. Remember, you can look really, really bright on some of these committees that are trying to figure this stuff out if you're bringing value of how it works to your organization. And there are others that know. I think I have another poll question coming up. In fact, I'm quite positive I do. Let's pop that baby up. Oops, yep, as it comes to measurement. So, what is your familiarity level with HEDIS scores, star ratings, and value-based contracting in general? I fully understand these terms. I have limited understanding of these terms. I have very little knowledge of these terms. or D, I never want to hear these terms again. No, we don't have a D. Whatever your level of knowledge is, again, this will be good for us as we get through the rest of this section. And if you have questions, please submit them. And don't forget, after filling out the poll question, to hit the submit button or it won't go through. Okay, measuring performance. HEDIS. HEDIS is a comprehensive set of standardized performance measures designed to provide purchasers and consumers with the information they need for reliable comparison of health plan performance. HEDIS is a data set that's set up to measure health plan performance. What's happened is there are a couple of ways that these HEDIS measures get put into value-based contracts, because now the plan is working with providers to try to drive the performance of the plan. Remember the big difference between Medicare and Medicare Advantage. There's a commercial payer in the middle of that mix, okay? So if we switch to sort of how does HEDIS work, there are 6 domains, 90 measures across these 6 domains of care. Some of them we can directly impact, some of them are more health plan specific. But if you think experience of care, effectiveness of care, utilization and risk-adjusted utilization, those are areas that all providers will be affected by in their value-based contracts. Comprehensive diabetes care is one HEDIS example. So if you look at this and you think, gosh, how many of these things could be done or are being done at point of care? Hemoglobin A1C testing. Then there's 3 subsets of measurements: poor control, less than 8, or less than 7 for a selected population. So all the value-based contracts get set up using some element of these diabetes measures. Eye exams, retinal eye exam performed, medical attention for nephropathy. Oh, there's a link between diabetes and kidneys again. And then blood pressure control. All of these things part of the HEDIS measures, and most of them work their way into value-based contracts because of that. That makes sense. Here's an example, a further example of that diabetes care measurement. Hemoglobin A1C, blood pressure. Look, nephropathy, urine rest, ACE and ARB prescription or visits to nephrologist during the year. Dilated retinal exam. Look at the common chart deficiencies. This is a little bit sad, but I have to point it out with this arrow. Incomplete information related to yearly lab testing and results. So, minimally, if you think about the things that are on the previous page, and I'll go back to it, maybe it's 2 pages ago. A1Cs, eye exam, blood pressure control, kidney testing, all the things that we might do or could do at point of care, we can get documented in support of these value-based contract metrics if the people in the organization are aware, or maybe we need to bring it to them as an opportunity. See, I told you you'd be looking really good at the end of this term. Oh, look, here are our poll questions back. I fully understand these terms. 0. Well, it's a good thing you attended today then. I have limited understanding, 31%, and hopefully getting better each moment. And then I have very little knowledge of these terms, and that was 65%. So, folks, I hope and we still have slides to go, I hope we're improving these terms or your knowledge of these terms, and you're starting to connect them to the value and the things that you do at point of care. People need to know how valuable what you do is to these broader contracts. So, this is a common chart deficiency in the HEDIS measures, and payers would be the first ones to say that. Here's another HEDIS example, screening. So colonoscopy obviously fills the bill here. Fecal occult blood testing in the measurement year, but ones done in an office setting or with a digital rectal exam do not count. Look down here at common chart deficiencies. Colorectal screening is not consistently documented. This isn't, as much related to your point of care world, but these are things that are part of the HEDIS measures, and these are typically in value-based contracts. A lot of screening elements are in your value-based contract. So if you're thinking, hey, we could do that screening or we could be involved in that, somebody would probably be interested in knowing that. So the HEDIS measures kind of roll into the Medicare star rating system. So Medicare reviews plan performance yearly and releases new star ratings each fall. Medicare Advantage plans are rated how well they perform in 5 different categories. So here are some of those same categories we saw in HEDIS: staying healthy, screening, tests and vaccines, managing chronic conditions long-term, plan responsiveness and care, member complaints, problem getting services, choosing to leave the plan, health plan customer service. Here's what I would say about this star rating system. It's worth a ton of bonus money to the commercial plan if they're a 4.5 or 5-star plan. The other thing that you can see, and you'll see it in your own local markets, a Medicare Advantage plan that's a 5-star plan can market itself year-round. Otherwise, if they're less than a 5-star plan, they can only market during open enrollment. So when you see the TV ads start up in the fall and you've been seeing one plan advertised all year, the one plan that's been advertising all year is a 5-star plan. But the bottom line is these star rating systems are built into the value-based contracts as well. Same measures, more focused by the plans trying to improve their star ratings through collaboration really with the provider group that they're building the contract with, if that makes sense. All right, take a deep breath. I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm going to take a deep breath, have a little sip of tea. That's kind of the heavy lifting. Now we go back and say, okay, so we've covered a lot. We've talked about different types of value-based contracts. We've talked about the key elements in specific value-based contracts. We've talked about Medicare Advantage and risk adjustment scores being really important if your organization is part of a Medicare Advantage contract. We've spent some time doing the math so that you can see how valuable specific things that you could test for or are testing for are impacting these contracts. Now we want to say, okay, so what can labs do? What can I do as a laboratorian or a point of care coordinator or an ancillary VP? What can I do as it relates to thinking about these contracts as I'm thinking about the point of care testing we're either doing or could do? And so let's spend a little time there. I'm one slide off, sorry. As it relates to star ratings, this was 2 examples that we talked about earlier in the HEDIS and value-based contract world. These would also be part of the star ratings. So percent of plan members with diabetes who had a hemoglobin A1C test during the year that showed their average blood sugar is under control, less than 9. Some of you would argue it should be less than 8. Some may even argue less than 7. That number, you should know if you're trying to help your organization, know what your contract says. What are we trying to achieve? And then a percent of plan members with diabetes who had a kidney function test. This goes back to, okay, if I've got, a 15% diabetic population or a 20%, have I done kidney function tests on all of them? Here's something else that's important to know, and it goes back to your rules-based technology and your point-of-care solutions. Do the solutions that I'm using allow me to target specific criteria and create a report? And the reason that may be important is you need to know that many of these metrics only count if they're the last measurement of the year. Let me say that again. The value-based contract is set up so that only the last measurement of the year either gets you credit or not credit. So let's use A1C here in this example to prove my point. So let's say I do an A1C in July on one of my patients that's in a value-based plan, and it's 8.9, and I have this number right here. Less than 9 is my the place I get credit. If they come back, so I get an 8.9 in July, they come back in September and they're 9.1. I am not going to get credit for that patient unless I get them back in and another test before the end of the year that's below 9. So think about the value you can bring simply looking at your patients who are having stuff done at point of care if you're aware of the criteria that are in the contracts that you're servicing. So that's one example, again, of using the technology that you have to your advantage and that of your organization. I threw this slide in real quickly to show you that not all criteria are the same. And Rick will be proud of me because I'm going to use one of my tools here. I'm pointing at the, maybe he'll be proud of me, I'm trying to use a tool. I'm pointing at the 3. So you can see that diabetes blood sugar is weighted 3.0. That means the plan, the health plan that's administering for these patients, this particular measurement is 3 times more important than the BMI. And so I give you that because this is the way the plans build contracts. They look at the things that are most important to the star ratings. They look at the things that your group can impact, and then they try to build a contract to impact things that both your providers can impact and that they're going to get credit for as a plan. It kind of pulls people together collaboratively. All right, that's it. I'm moving on to the next slide, which is, again, your value to this whole ecosystem. Here's the key takeaway. Labs and laboratorians and point-of-care managers can help their patients and their organization achieve success in value-based contracting. Almost all health systems are in some sort of value-based contract now. Those value-based contracts are set up in 2 areas, right? Improve metrics on the quality side and lower cost. Sometimes a lower cost can be a higher priced test done in a higher priced way that keeps something bad from happening downstream. Sometimes you could do a point of care test that's a little more expensive, but ultimately it gets done and you get credit in your value-based contract versus the patient never getting to a lab. So thinking more globally about the things you do can bring a lot of value to these contracts. A lab increases its value to its patient and parent organization by making the organization successful in those contracts. So it comes down to extracting and presenting key data, identifying and supporting the documentation of underlying medical conditions that drive up risk adjustment scores. Start thinking and working with people in your organization who are thinking about risk adjustment and accurate documentation. You will be a rock star if you can bring some value to those conversations from your point of care world. Use those lab results to show achievement of HEDIS or other performance measures once you know what they are in your value-based contracts. And believe me, folks, these contracts exist and they're scorecards that you can look at. So you could sit down with somebody in Pop Health or in the quality contracting department and look at these contracts and go, oh, there's 4 or 5 things that we influence or could influence. Let's work on those. Moving right along, 2 categories that are in almost every value-based contract are diabetes and chronic kidney disease. I'm stomping my foot. I'm stomping my foot. I'm stomping my foot. 2 categories that are in almost every value-based contract are diabetes and chronic kidney disease. Hemoglobin A1C and creatinine are well established as accurate in the point-of-care testing world. So this is like what we call a 6-inch putt, right, in golf. These are areas that if you're doing this at point of care, and I look over at our poll questions and think there's opportunity to bring your value to the forefront of the organization if you're doing these sorts of testing in that environment. And here's how we do it. Get out your coffee card. Well, wait, once we're back to congregating in groups of, well, once we're back to congregating at all, I'm in my office by myself. How do I get involved with those folks in the organization that are involved in value-based contracting? You buy them a cup of coffee and you start asking really good questions about these contracts. the CFO and the Director of Finance are going to be really interested in the performance of these contracts. So is your VP of Quality and or POP Health Manager or Director. So whoever is running that segment of your business, buy them a cup of coffee, bring all your point of care knowledge about the testing that you're doing and the metrics you're impacting, and ask them to see these scorecards for your value-based contracts. Practice administrator or the chief operating officer would be other people that are interested in these contracts and probably sitting on one of these committees in your organization. And finally, revenue cycle director, health information manager. So if you've got somebody that's truly assigned to just managing your data, another person that would be good to meet. Just tell them that you've sat in on the coolest webinar ever that made you really proud of your point of care data, and that you wanted to see how it might connect to value-based contracts. I think you'll find that people who don't know what you do or maybe aren't fully aware of the data that you're influencing will be interested in learning that. Make it known that you're knowledgeable about how these contracts work and that you have valuable data for them. Join committees that address value-based care tracking if they're in your organization, and my guess is they are. And then consider where additional point-of-care testing could be implemented to impact value-based care and quality measures. Unless people are connected to you, they probably aren't even thinking about the impact that you could have. And I know this from being a chief operating officer. You know, the only time somebody, you know, was interested in solving a problem is if somebody was yelling about it, right? So you don't need to yell. You just need to talk to the folks on the top of this slide and let them know how valuable the data is that you're sitting on, potentially, for the value-based contracts in your organization. So the bottom line is this: we are in the process of transitioning to value-based reimbursement models. Most everybody is involved in at least some portion of these particular models. Most healthcare organizations are involved in some type that has downside risk now. So that's a game changer for most groups. And you know, it's one thing if you're going to be paid extra money for doing good work. It's another if you're going to have to pay money back if you're not getting credit for doing good work. So you know, the more downside risk that is taken by folks, I think the more valuable what you're doing in point of care becomes to them. Medicare Advantage is one type of value-based contract. It is the fastest growing healthcare insurance in the U.S. So as I get to my last bullet here, if you have questions and you haven't sent them in, we're getting towards the question time. Please type them up and send them in so we have time to address them, because I guess I need to get right to those questions, or we're going to probably run out of time. So if you have a question you've been sitting on, please type it up and send it in. That would be great. And then finally, last point here before we wrap up and get to questions is point-of-care testing. I think I just bring to value-based contracts with real-time data. You can improve care and positively impact costs with what you do. So that's it. That takes me to the question and answer period. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for participating in the polls as you did.
Well, thank you, Matt. What a fantastic job that was, and thank you for simplifying all of those complicated terms and everything for everybody. And we do have some really good questions here, so let's move right to the first one.
Okay.
This is a good one. How do I even know if we have value-based contracts in our organization?
So probably the fastest way to figure that out is a call to someone in your finance department or in the quality department. And the reason I say that is all of these value-based contracts, when the payers come in, and they typically will come into an organization quarterly to review performance. That's where the scorecard will go up on a TV screen, and we'll look at the performance of the providers that are seeing these patients. Finance will be looking at the cost side of these contracts, and quality will be looking at the metrics. When I say quality, it could be your population health team, could be a revenue cycle director, but somebody in those two areas of your business will be aware of value-based contracts that you've signed and can give you some guidance, and probably willing to show you the scorecards if you show interest in trying to impact some of those things.
Terrific. Here's somebody who wants to be proactive. Who should I talk to about getting more involved in helping with value-based contracting?
Same two groups. I mean, I think if you know right now after this presentation that you're sitting on valuable information that the organization isn't digesting, don't be shy about it. You could say, listen, I sat through a very interesting presentation that sort of showed some of the value of the data that we're bringing into the organization. I'd love to talk to somebody on the finance side, and start at the CFO level. Don't be shy, right? Same thing. I sat in on an interesting presentation. I know we have data that's potentially going to impact the value-based contracts if we sign them. Who on your staff is part of the value-based contract team? Do the same thing on the quality side. And if you don't have a quality department and a VP that you can go to or a director, start with the CMO. Your chief medical officer is involved in all of these meetings as well, and they're actually out working with the physicians on this documentation typically to get them to improve, especially on the Medicare Advantage contracts.
Terrific, thank you. And our last question for right now, do you have any more examples of HEDIS star scores that involve lab-related data?
I do. Let me see. Creatinine, I think I mentioned. Potassium. So we need to, monitor BMP. So if you're doing creatinine or potassium levels at point of care, PTINR. Sometimes it needs to be tracked as part of a measurement or metric. Certainly we talked about hemoglobin A1Cs, monitoring of liver enzymes if you're doing any of that at point of care. Even something as simple as a urine dip, depending on how that screen is being captured, what's happening with the result of that. I think sometimes we think it's got to be some kind of complicated task. Something as relevant as a urine dip to screen for kidney disease, capturing that data, getting a claim filed, maybe attaching a CPT2 code to it to make sure the payer sees the work you've done. Something as simple as that at point of care can be very impactful to a value-based contract.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And that is perfect timing because we have reached our scheduled stop time. And thank you for joining us. A big thanks to our good friends at Orchard Software for sponsoring today's event. And Matt, let me say again, fantastic presentation, and you're a wonderful presenter. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. I really am excited about the content, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to so many folks about it. I think most of you will find a nice audience in your organizations for the work that you're doing and the data that you're pulling in.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And to all of you, biggest thanks go to you for joining us. We hope that you'll join us again very soon for another webinar sponsored by Orchard Software. And for now, good luck and good health. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.